Now it's time to address the topic of inaction directly. We've taken a while to get here. The journey from extended mind, biosemiotics, and ecological psychology. These are useful reference points. They're all very important in the field of cognitive science, of embodied cognitive science. Inaction is more than this. So we've taken our time to get here, and we're going to stay with the topic of inaction specifically for the next 2 weeks. I've got a variety of readings which will introduce you to the sometimes rather formidable jargon of the territory. One of the first readings I set you is taken from Stefan Käufer and Tony Shimero's Enactivism and the Embodied Mind chapter in the Introduction to Phenomenology, an excellent book for those of you who are daunted by phenomenology. And the quote on the screen there is from that book, and it's a useful way to start to reorient our thinking. It says, experience is not something that happens to our brains. They might have said, or is produced by our brains. Instead, it is something we do, typically by moving our body around our physical and cultural environments. Now, this resets the theme to one of ongoing activity rather than consideration of some kind of abstract state. Notice that the activity of the body doesn't make the brain terrifically special. The brain is part of this, of course, a very important part, but we're not positing a fundamental disjunction between the nervous system and the rest of the body. The second thing is this slightly uncomfortable phrase here, physical and cultural environments. As we'll see, the notion of environment, context, world, surround, milieu, becomes very fluid as we enter this style of thinking. So, with that on board, we need to look back at the history of the concept. There was some work done in the 1970s, collaborative work done in Chile between Umberto Maturana and Francisco Varela. Now, Maturana is a biologist. He recently passed, unfortunately. Varela was a neuroscientist. And Varela came to Maturana. He joined Maturana's program, where Maturana was concerned with trying to come up with a philosophically defensible understanding of what it is to be alive, what distinguishes the living from the non-living. If you look at a school textbook from biology, it will talk about life as having a variety of characteristics, things like metabolism and reproduction. And it's a bit of a shopping list that doesn't seem to single out any core essential property of life. And it was to this that Maturana turned. And because he was undertaking work in philosophical biology, his concern was the organization of a single cell as the most basic building block of all living beings. So the origins of this lie in consideration of the biochemical domain, in which we're interested in biochemical processes and in all their complexity. This is before we get to inaction proper. The Tree of Knowledge, this book came out in 1980, whatever it was, 1998, this version, first published in 1987, that's right. And this was deliberately published outside of the conventional academic publishing houses, published by Shambhala Press. And its style is distinctly non-academic. It's full of funny little drawings. Drawings of the two authors recur prominently throughout. And it begins to articulate an immense philosophical landscape in which the activities of the living are absolutely central. And it already seeks to use this insight to build accounts not just of single cells, but of multi-celled organisms, of social organization, and ultimately of all the activity in the biosphere. So it's a tremendously ambitious task. Now, a new term was coined in this context, and that is, by production of these two guys, autopoiesis. I think that Maturana claims the term for himself. It means self-production. And an autopoietic system, as originally conceived, is basically what we find in a cell. Whether there are other autopoietic systems we might ask about, but we're going to take the cell as the canonical autopoietic system, a system whose activity can be understood as producing itself. And such systems have a lot of important characteristics. Two terms that are very important in this context are the notion of operational closure and structural coupling. Let's take operational closure first. If we look down into a seething mass of biochemicals, we'll find an awful lot of processes going on, chemical processes, which transform products, transform inputs into outputs, which consume and produce products. And if you've done any study in biochemistry, you'll know that within the cell, for example, we find a whole host of cyclically organized processes in which A produces compounds B, which in turn produce C, which in turn produce D, which in turn produce A. That is, they're cyclically linked. Now in the diagram here, if you regard each node on the diagram here as a process that consumes and produces, what we see is that while there are many such going on, those that belong to a single system like the cell can be distinguished from those that are exterior to it. So you'll see that there are links joining the nodes here, and very, very many links in many directions. But we can draw a distinction between the black nodes, which have a kind of a mutual dependence, such that each produces something that is required by something else within the same chain or network. There are links from the black nodes to the gray nodes. Those will be biochemical processes that produce something that play no further role. So there might be excretions or exhalations. And there are arrows going from the gray nodes into the black nodes. This could be conceived of, for example, as taking in resources from the environment, making use of ambient oxygen, feeding, and so on. But the black nodes have a unity in that they partake in a collective organization in which everything contributes. That's the notion of operational closure. Suggests that we can distinguish between this closed cycle of processes and exterior processes, which may be drawn upon and may be contributed to, but do not form part of this mutual linkage that constitutes the autopoietic system. That's operational closure. So once we've identified these black nodes, it's tempting to see, well, we distinguish an inside from an outside. So there's an inside where all the red stuff is, and an outside. And indeed, in the cell, we find such a border. We find it in the membrane. Not all systems we will consider are membrane-bound, but in this canonical example of the cell, we actually have a physical membrane, so it allows us to distinguish spatially the inside from the outside of the cell. But this should not be regarded as closed. No life form is closed, and if that black line, if that membrane were impermeable, the processes inside would very quickly die. Instead, we use this formalism, which has become something of a standard. Here, I think it's a very elegant way of describing what we were just talking about. We have the system, which is indicated by the closed loop to indicate the mutuality, whereby all the processes involved contribute to the needs of the other processes involved. We have the environment indicated with a wavy line. And we have reciprocity. We have the regulated exchange across the boundary, as found canonically in cellular metabolism. So an inactive system always comes with this kind of structure. We can distinguish the system from the environment, and this regulated exchange will acquire a name which will be unpacked in various ways. Initially, we're just going to call it sensemaking. I said organizational closure allows us to make these distinctions. Structural coupling is another very important term widely used in this book, which should be familiar to us after having looked at the Umwelt of Jacob von Uexküll, where we saw that the world as it appears to an earthworm appears in forms given by the earthworm's constitution, its body and metabolic processes. So if we change the structure of the earthworm, we change the structure of its Umwelt. So there's a mutuality between this environment that we've recognized, which is predicated entirely upon the system that we've picked out. Having picked out a system, we can recognize its environment, but if we change the system, for example, add more sensitivity to it or new capacities for action, then the entirety of the rest of the cosmos that is relevant to this system also changes. So this structural coupling suggests that organisms and their environments in this broadest sense are mutually linked and will change over time. This is a very important way of thinking about the complex nature of evolutionary processes, of ecological niche formulation, and so on. It's perhaps simplest to see on a diagram like this, where in this case, the hummingbird and the associated flower clearly share a long mutual history of co-evolution, and to consider one form without the other would be to miss something very essential indeed. Of course, a simple dyadic relationship of one bird to one flower is insufficient, and in considering ecological processes more generally, they don't come in pairs. Nonetheless, the fact that one cannot study an organism without studying its environment in this sense and their co-development over time. This is a very useful insight that leads to new thinking in evolutionary thinking. Now, let's come back to those links between the system and its environment. I glossed them there as sense-making. And for Maturana and Varela at this stage, sense-making is cognition. It's whatever is going on. It's a minimal sort of way of understanding that the activity of the cell is in the cell's own interests. Not because of anything anybody else said or did, no goals were imposed on it, but the cell is self-producing. And Ezekiel de Paolo has neatly summed up, I think, the essence of autopoiesis as the combination of self-distinction and self-production. Now, the article there by, some of the articles that you've got go beyond this basic view of a single system and its regulated exchange with its environment to consider sociality and mutuality when there's more than one system involved. We will be moving on to such themes primarily next week, but they're always lurking here in the background. And so we have moved strongly now from the manner in which a strongly subject-object-based discourse works, in which subjects are ephemeral, nowhere to be found, objects are simply there for the taking, and the subject mysteriously acts upon a de-animated world. That's the world of cognitivism up there. And now we're looking at mutuality, where we see a system and its environment in a mutual kind of dance, as two hands are in a handshake. Now, we'll be getting to the philosophical foundations of enactive theory in just a moment, but it's here that we see that the system and its environment, as I have been somewhat uncomfortably calling them, can also be seen to, in their mutual dance, we get the co-arising of both subject and world. This is, as we'll find out, a Buddhist notion, which contrasts strongly with most of the objective discourse in Western science. In the readings you've got, there's a briefing by Marek McGann, who says something very useful. He says cognition is not something that occurs inside of an agent, but is a product of that interaction, just as a handshake is a product of an interaction. So using the same visual metaphor of the hand. And then from the strongly biogenic world of Pamela Lyon and Fred Kaiser, we get, except perhaps in the narrowest of circumstances, psychological explanations cannot bracket the rest of the body. Mental features such as affect and feeling and the fact that cognitive processes rely on phenomena outside the agent. Second generation cognitive science thus is frequently referred to as embodied, embedded, situated, inactive, interactionist, and so on. So it's this total involvement of world and body that we are going to be dealing with. So that's the biological foundation, but inaction doesn't appear as a distinguished philosophical discourse until this book in 1991, at which stage Francisco Varela had left Maturana's lab. And this book is written by Evan Thompson, Eleanor Roche, and Francisco Varela in 1991, The Embodied Mind. And it has turned 30 recently, and there's a new edition out of it. It leaves the biochemical domain behind to develop these theoretical ideas more broadly in a manner more useful for considering large body beings such as us and complex forms of sociality and ecology. It leaves autopoietic theory in the strict sense behind, and the word autopoiesis does not occur in the book. And it self-consciously draws from Mahayana Buddhism, which is not a tradition that Maturana was drawing from. It is a tradition that Varela understood very well. Evan Thompson was reared in an environment which combined Western and Eastern philosophy very usefully, and Eleanor Roche was herself a practicing Buddhist, so they knew a lot about the discourse about how things come into being and go out of being within Buddhism, which provides very useful figures of thought. And this co-arising of subject and world has its origin in Mahayana Buddhism. But the Buddhist relations of the Buddhist motivation for inactive theory has not been strongly pursued since. So we won't strongly pursue it either. Nonetheless, this book was absolutely seminal. And since then, we can distinguish, in fact, several inactive traditions that have grown out of this book. The one we will be most concerned with is sometimes misleadingly called autopoietic inaction, to emphasize the continuity with the work of Maturana and Varela, but the term autopoietic is unfortunate because, as I said, this work arises when autopoiesis has moved into the background. And here we'll find the work of Ezekiel Di Paolo, Hannah de Jager, Tom Fröse, Marek McGann, Thomas Fuchs, and many, many others. That's the tradition we will be exploring here. Last week, when we discussed this theory of sensory motor correspondences, we learned to start thinking about perception as a form of activity. And this idea of sensing as an activity is very close to the term sense-making within enactive theory. And so some people have called this an enactive account of perception, which is misleading. And O'Regan and Noe, the two authors of sensory motor contingency theory, have distanced themselves from that. So while it's very, very relevant to inaction generally, this is not a school of enactive theory. And then there's radical enactive theory by Daniel Hutto and Eric Mayen, radically enactive cognition, that's the REC. We won't be pursuing that. It exists as a schism within enactive theory. It's these authors on the left there that we'll be primarily following. And all this framing is necessary because I would encourage you to see inaction not as just another set of scientific hypotheses to which we bring our lab and carry on doing science as usual, because inaction requires a more profound shift. And it has been described, I think quite accurately, as a renewed philosophy of nature. Now, a philosophy of nature sounds very ambitious. Most science doesn't concern itself with that, to our detriment, it must be said. But philosophies of nature were perhaps more in vogue towards the end of the 19th century in Germany than now, but at a time of mass extinction, climate change, and so on, to explicitly consider the idea of a renewed philosophy of nature is perhaps not a bad thing, but that makes it clear what a big leap we're taking here. And here inaction becomes not just a suite of interrelated concepts, much less a set of methods, but quite self-consciously a stance with respect to which a stance we take as we describe the activities of the living, knowing that we are among the living and including ourselves within this. That poses challenges, of course. There can be no simplistic reliance on insides and outsides, or on this dualisms that make mind separate from bodies and our information separate from matter. So this is where this inactive theory is going, and it's very, very much work in progress. Not everybody sees it this way, but that should give you a sense of the scale of the undertaking. There is a lot of jargon here, and we'll encounter some of it. You'll encounter a lot of it in the articles where I've chosen articles that help to unpack these terms. Perhaps the most central notion in inactive theory is the notion of autonomy. It was the autonomous nature of the operationally closed system that allowed us to say, to talk of it as a self-production and self-distinction. And that is always at the heart of inactive thinking. But once you've taken that move, a whole bunch of other concepts sort of fall out and become interrelated. We've met sensemaking, which is the activity of the system. We described it as a regulated exchange across a membrane in the case of the single cell. But that notion of sensemaking is capable of being elaborated to address rather traditional questions in questions of perception and action, or activity, or goal-directed activity. And next week we'll see a very important development of the notion of sensemaking in participatory sensemaking, when two such systems become entangled, as it were. We won't find here most of the standard psychological concepts. We won't find concepts, for example. The language used often draws from dynamical systems theory, which studies processes that change over time, patterns of change in time. And this is a very useful mathematical vocabulary to have at our disposal, because it allows for the description of emergent patterns. Emergent patterns are patterns which arise through the interaction at a different level of lots of small entities. So a traffic jam is an emergent phenomenon, for example, that arises when the cars get snarled up in a particular way. No car makes a traffic jam, but traffic jams arise through the interaction of cars. And there's a good mathematical language for richly describing emergent patterning. One notion that has been developed, it must be said, by Ezequiel Di Paolo and Xavier Barandarian is the notion of adaptivity. This seeks to extend the basic autopoietic self-distinction to allow something like predictive processing, if I may say. That is, to allow the system to recognize, to distinguish between more healthier or more beneficial forms of action and less beneficial forms of action. A very minimal distinction, very important to the theory as developed by Ezequiel and Xavier, but still work in progress and not used by everybody. One more thing that's going to come out of, by starting with autonomy, is a non-Mysterian treatment of normativity and value, of things mattering. Now, theories of meaning tend to be utterly abstract, pulled out of thin air, but a theory of normativity and value is very strongly grounded once we begin with autonomy, as we'll see. And there's the basic philosophical move, which was kicked off by Maturana, it must be said, is to equate more or less the two domains of mind and life, so that the living gives rise to what we will ultimately come to discuss in terms of mind. Now, staying with the single cell, the consideration of the single cell has been so very enriching within this discussion that an awful lot of the times you might ask yourself, why is a single cell being discussed so much when single cells are not terribly interesting, perhaps? So one example has been discussed more than any other in the inactive literature, and that's the idea of a single E. coli bacterium in a petri dish in which there's a single nutrient source, which creates a gradient. So the closer you get to the source, the higher the concentration of sucrose. And cells swim using a means known as chemotaxis to detect the chemical gradients and swim upstream. And it's in the cell's own interests to move towards the nutrient source. So this example is used to frame and interlink a lot of the concepts that we've just met. As Lionel Kaiser said, a biogenic approach, that's their version of Enaction, allows a fundamental starting point for articulating what a minimal form of cognition might look like, and that is the role played by this chemotactically ascending E. coli bacterium in a petri dish. First of all, we've noted that we can recognize the cell as a distinguished entity to whom we might attribute a self through using the notion of operational closure to identify those processes that have a mutuality which are linked together in the continuous self-production of the cell. That's the autonomous identity of the cell. So we've gone from recognizing this mutuality to a notion of identity or self, a very simple notion of identity or self. And then we can ask, in a biosemiotic fashion, what is the world that arises for a cell? In this case, because we have made our toy example so simple, it's a single gradient, a single direction, if you like. It allows us to begin to cautiously, and now this word has to be wielded cautiously, to adopt the perspective of the cell. That is to say, well, glucose is just one chemical among millions for me, but for our cell here, glucose is intrinsically meaningful because of the role that it plays in the biochemical processes of the cell. This means that glucose has something like an inherent normativity or value or meaning for the cell. Other chemicals to which it's not sensitive don't feature. They don't feature in its Umwelt and they are irrelevant. So you can see how this, Mark McGann has called this the autonomy cascade, beginning with the notion of autonomous organization to found a minimal definition of self, we enter into a suite of interlocked concepts. Now, a lot of ink has been spilled in describing the mechanics of chemotaxis, in describing the rather funny manner of locomotion of an E. coli bacterium, and some of those you can see there. But the details are, frankly, from a philosophical point of view, irrelevant. We could also consider the same single cell from a biosemiotic point of view, and ask the Merkwelt and the Wirkwelt, you remember, fuse together to provide the Umwelt. For the Merkwelt, we have the world of signification or signs. In this case, the glucose is signaling to the cell. And the Wirkwelt is the world of effective action. And Jakob von Uxküll asked you to squint and sort of stereoscopically fuse these to create the notion of the Umwelt. And we can do that here by recognizing that in both cases, the situation we've outlined speaks with one voice. There's a single direction. A single direction is being signaled and a single direction is being followed. But one can overdo the use of this single example, as useful as it is. And one of the readings for this week is an article by myself and Paulo de Jesus, in which we just work out this example yet again in the literature. But note that this cell, as we have drawn it, is actually nothing more than a simple first-order cybernetic system, a feedback-controlled system, no different formally from a thermostat, a mere thermostat. It has a homeostatic form of existence. And two things that it lacks that all living beings have are historicity and sociality. So it got here through some process of development and ultimately generation. It has ancestors. It has an evolutionary history. We have not considered that here. And sociality. This cell interacts with nothing and all life is inherently social. So there's two very crucial aspects that this is missing. And we'll be turning to those next week largely as we discuss the social side of enactive theory, introducing the notion of participatory sense-making and turning towards social cognition. So we'll be going beyond the individual. Now, there has been a wealth of literature that has developed out of this. So we've mentioned The Embodied Mind, that 1991 book started. I just raided my bookshelves and we find here some works by Alvin Noe. So I see one of them on the screen there. Out of Our Heads is very good. Alvin Noe, you remember, with O'Regan, developed a theory of sensory motor correspondences. Alvin Noe is an independent operator. His philosophical writing is very compatible with most forms of enactive theory. Out of Our Heads is an excellent book, or Action in Perception, if you want to study the close relationship between sensory motor correspondence theory and the notion of sense-making as it arises here. I said dynamics is the natural language of this, so work done primarily in a mathematical register. Here's two very influential books by Scott Kelso. Dynamic Patterns from 1995, and later, together with Engstrom, The Complementary Nature. These provide a lot of the basic mathematical tools that are used as Enaction turns its attention to human activity. And as if the sudden appearance of Buddhism wasn't enough, The Complementary Nature draws heavily on Taoist ideas of complementarity. We live in 2021. We can no longer pretend that we have a single philosophical heritage, starting with the Greeks and coming through us through Descartes and Kant. The world is actually much bigger than that. Tony Shimero's book provided one of the reading. His phenomenology book, Radical Embodied Cognitive Science, seeks to bridge between enaction and other kinds of embodied cognitive science, specifically the world of ecological psychology. Relations between enaction and ecological psychology have generated an awful lot of discussion and debate. There's been a lot of work on working to ground a kind of scientific approach that can deal with phenomenology, that can take experience or qualitative attributes of lived experience seriously. Phenomenology as a tradition has had a hard time interacting with science, but here we see a book, The Phenomenological Mind, by Sean Gallagher and Dan Zahavi. It was Sean Gallagher who suggested, I think among others, that enaction should be better viewed as a renewed philosophy of nature. So phenomenological concerns, and many phenomenologists are being drawn here, they are finally coming to the table, and you'll find the work of particularly Maurice Merleau-Ponty, but also Hans Jonas and some others appear regularly. What else have we got here? Mind and Life. Evan Thompson went on to write this stonking book, came out in about 2008, in which the thesis that life and mind are different sides of the same concept is explored in depth. It's a wonderful, wonderful and very foundational book. And then in 2011, there was a compilation showing how enactive theory had grown. This is called Enaction Towards a New Paradigm for Cognitive Sciences. Very many contributions going in all kinds of directions, showing that the field is really taking off. And some recent books of merit, How Things Shape the Mind, A Theory of Material Engagement, takes enactive theory and considers it in the realm of archaeology and prehistory. This is by Lambros Malafouris, and it's a wonderful, wonderful book showing how these ideas are very, very generative. If you're interested in following the ideas of Umberto Maturana, he's not an easy man to crack. The best place to start is this book called From Being to Doing, by The Origins of the Biology of Cognition. And it's based on an interview by this guy, Bernhard Purksen, who interviews Maturana and then summarizes the interview. So that's very good. One last one, recent edition by Ezekiel Di Paolo, Hanna Dieger, and Elena Kufari, is Linguistic Bodies, in which this theory is being developed to come up with a radically renewed stance with respect to language. So we'll leave it there. As you can see, we're entering into an area that is relatively new, growing very fast, doesn't pick out a single well-defined field with hard borders, but introduces a vast array of topics that help to address many of the puzzles that we've met in cognitive science so far. We'll leave it at that.